So without any further ado, I will say welcome and thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming out. So this obviously has been on my mind for the last better part of a month. And so I'm very excited to hear your questions. I have prepared a presentation giving you a little bit of a background on the current situation. I should say right away, I am not an area expert on the Ukraine or on Russia. I study war and peace, so large patterns of cooperation and conflict. So I've been following this really as an example of how conflicts unfold, how they escalate and how they de-escalate. I'm happy to answer questions anytime, either throughout the talk or at the end. So I'm very curious to hear what you want to know. So maybe a little bit of background. Of course, war is always a really bad deal. This is a bad thing. This is not the only war that's going on, but that you are all here kind of shows that this war is special in some ways. First of all, it's taking place in the heart of Europe, very close to home for me. I am from Berlin, which is about, I think, 800 miles from Kiev. So that's about the same distance from here to, I think, Chicago, a little less, right? So it's well within driving distance. The distance between Kiev and Warsaw is about half of that. So it's very, very close. But also what makes this war particularly scary is that you have a nuclear-armed superpower on one side and not quite a nuclear-armed superpower on the other side. Of course, Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons currently. But if you look at this map, Russia is, of course, red. The gray countries are countries that are not members of NATO, and the blue countries, the light blue and dark blue countries, are NATO countries. And even though NATO is not formally part of this conflict, much of this conflict revolves around the Ukraine's relationship to NATO. And that's something we have to discuss as well. And the third reason why this conflict is really unique, I would say, or this war is unique, is that even though most experts fully expected Vladimir Putin to violently posture and demand territorial concessions from the Ukraine in the run-up to the war, very few experts actually predicted an outright invasion of the kind that we have actually seen, which at least initially seemed to target not just regions that Russia has long claimed an interest in, the Donbas regions, which you see there in the east of the Ukraine, but seem to have targeted Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, and Ukraine as a country itself. And so the character of this invasion really took many experts by surprise. Some more than others. Of course, the United States and the British Secret Services have been warned or had been warning that Russia is planning to invade. But again, the scale of the invasion and the particular kind of strategy that it was pursuing was really surprising. So what is this conflict actually about? It's a very, very short history. I'm not going to go too much in depth here. But basically, as you all know, Ukraine used to be part of what used to be the Soviet Union. The word evil empire came up. Full disclosure, I grew up in the shadow, not of the evil empire. I grew up in East Germany. So for us, the Soviet Union was the brother country, and the evil empire was the United States. But in 1991, the Ukraine, together with many other former Soviet republics, declared formally independence. And for as much as we know about Vladimir Putin, it's kind of a moment that he very much regrets. So he really, I think, in some ways mourns the loss of the Soviet empire. And I think part of this attachment to the Ukraine really comes from that history. Now, since its independence, Ukraine really has been kind of a flashpoint in Europe. It's really at the border between the East and the West. And the current war is an escalation of an ongoing conflict, or a conflict that had been ongoing since 2014. So in 2014, the Ukraine witnessed large pro-democracy protests. It's called the Euromaidan, which actually brings to power eventually a pro-Western government. So Russia is not super excited about this, right? So again, the Ukraine is basically the last bulwark before NATO members, European Union members, the last bulwark before the East, but before the West. So in response to this Euromaidan protest movements, Russia actually annexes Crimea which is this peninsula in the Black Sea. And it actually starts supporting separatists in the so-called Donbass region, which is highlighted there with a red rim around it. It's actually two different kinds of provinces. One is called Donetsk and the other is called Luhansk. And in these areas, basically, in Donetsk and Luhansk, separatists have been fighting the central Ukrainian government since 2014. It's a really bloody conflict. About 10,000 people have died in this conflict from both sides, both from the central government, civilians, and the separatists. And Russia has, throughout this conflict, supported the separatists, not just with weapons, but also with a large-scale propaganda effort, right? So if you hear Vladimir Putin talking, Ukraine is committing basically genocide against the Russian-speaking minority in these areas. Again, I don't want to minimize how costly this conflict was, but these 10,000 people who were killed were from both sides, not just Russians. So this is 2014. Of course, the central government in the Ukraine has also supporters in the West, the United States and the European Union and NATO support its claim to Donetsk and Luhansk and assisted it in pushing back the separatists. Now, why did Russia actually invade the Ukraine? Nominally, he claims that he wants to denazify and demilitarize the Ukraine and stop the genocide in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas. The speech that he gave just at the eve of the invasion was, by all accounts, the most political observers were really stunned by it because it sounded rather crazy. What does it mean to denazify and demilitarize a country? Well, denazify really presumes that there need to be Nazis there. And surely there are some far-right parties within the Ukraine, but no more or no less than in other European countries. To demilitarize a country, we really have to think about what this means. This is a sovereign country. Ukraine is an independent sovereign country. It has full control over its territory. It has every right to have a military to defend itself. To ask for a country to be demilitarized basically means to take away an essential part of what makes it an independent state, its sovereignty, right? So it's something that you cannot ask of a country. You cannot say, hey, United States, we feel you're kind of threatening to us. Let's get rid of your military. That doesn't actually make any sense. And when Putin gave this presentation, this speech, experts immediately noticed that whatever goals he put out there were actually non-negotiable. There were goals that did not line up with reality. The closest analogy I can think about is before the run-up to the war in Iraq, George Bush asked Saddam Hussein to give up nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. And of course, this was a complicated course of bargaining into action. But the point is, Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and so he couldn't give them up, right? So if you ask somebody too much that they cannot actually fulfill, you're basically backing yourself into a conflict. So it sounds a little bit too crazy. So of course, we know that Putin has a long-standing beef with Ukraine. He does not want the Ukraine to become a member of NATO. We'll talk more about this in a moment. He probably is not very excited about the prospect of the Ukraine joining the European Union, right? Like moving towards the West. And of course, we also know that Putin really has an interest in protecting the separatist territories and protecting Russia's control of the Crimea. So most experts kind of translated this denazify and demilitarize as an extreme version of these three goals. But again, the way that that Russia actually set up the war against Ukraine and started the invasion actually suggested that they wanted indeed more control and not just these rather limited things. Now, why does it all matter? Well, you can only really negotiate with someone or strategically bargain with someone if you have some understanding of what they're actually wanting. You never will know fully, right? Some very famous scholar once said that any kind of international negotiation is the partial exchange of partial information, because of course you want to maintain the upper hand for as much as possible. But a lot of this run up to the conflict really took by surprise. Okay, so now in the media, you often hear this claim, or at least at the beginning, that this conflict is really the fault of NATO. And in fact, both Putin and the US media tend to quote a scholar, John Mersheimer, who's at the University of Chicago. I happen to actually know him quite well, who has long, actually since 2014, argued that NATO expansion is an existential threat to Russia, or Russia perceives NATO expansion as an existential threat, and that both the annexation of Crimea and the Russian support of Donbass is really a result of NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe. Now, the first thing I want to say, the fact is that NATO did not threaten Russia directly, and did not invade Russia at all. In fact, Russia invaded the Ukraine. That leaves the question of whether or not NATO expansion is really a threat to Russia. This is really complicated because, of course, it is. International politics is characterized by what we call the security dilemma. Whatever makes one state safer has the potential to actually threaten another state, right? The United States has a very, very strong military. Why do we have a strong military? Well, of course, to defend ourselves. But if you ever encounter the US military anywhere in the world, you may actually not perceive it as a defensive military, but one that is there to threaten and take over and to conquer. So the security dilemma is really at the heart of most interaction in the international system. Now, what I also want to point out, NATO expansion has only partially been driven by NATO. NATO is not going around and says, hey, do you want to become a member? NATO has in fact been very cautious about expanding eastward. However, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and some of the other former East Bloc countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, were really clamoring to get into NATO. Why? Because they thought that this would be the best security guarantee against Russia. So Ukraine wanting to be admitted into NATO is not NATO saying, hey, Ukraine, you really should join us. It is Ukraine asking to be admitted because we just have to look at the current situation. They feel existentially threatened by Russia. NATO is an extremely powerful alliance. What makes NATO so powerful is the so-called Article 5, which really encapsulates the idea of collective self-defense. An attack against one NATO member is construed, or is automatically, there's no argument, considered an attack against all NATO members, which means the moment that one NATO member enters the conflict with the Ukraine, or a NATO member gets attacked by someone else, all other NATO members are automatically at war. This is supposed to deter conflicts from happening. It's supposed to prevent conflicts from breaking out by raising basically the potential costs of war from breaking out. So, in other words, saying that this is all NATO's fault is really oversimplifying a really, really complex situation, where on one hand, you have security-seeking smaller states like the Baltic states, like the Ukraine. Now Finland and Sweden are seriously considering joining NATO. They have remained neutral for a long time because they feel threatened by Russia's positioning and hostage. And of course, there's no question that Russia is also not very happy about eastward expansion of a very powerful alliance towards its borders. So on the map here, you can see as I mentioned, the blue countries are NATO countries. The darker colors are countries that joined earlier. The lighter colors are the latest waves of NATO membership admissions. And then the gray countries are currently not part of NATO, but some of them have interest, like Finland and Sweden, and I heard Austria as well. I'm not sure how serious this is. Okay, so it's not all NATO's fault, but NATO definitely plays a role in this conflict, which is very something I'll touch on in a moment. So if you ask me who's going to win this war, this is basically my takeaway point in a nutshell. This is a conflict that cannot be won. It cannot be won. Russia cannot win this conflict, and Ukraine will inevitably lose here as well. I'm not saying losing the war, but this particular war is so extremely, so costly that I would not consider anybody here really capable of winning. In fact, I would say the war was really lost for both sides the moment it started. Why? Well, Russia really badly miscalculated when it invaded the Ukraine. It's really unclear if they had bad information available or if they completely misjudged their own abilities. It's probably a combination of both. But What they really expected was that they would roll into the Ukraine and they would be more or less welcomed, that the central government would collapse within days, that the Ukraine would completely surrender. And then the plan, people assume plan A was that then Russia could install kind of like a puppet government or a friendly government that would be sympathetic to the Russian claims and provide kind of security guarantees. So this was plan A. And it became very quickly very clear that plan A was not working out. Right? The Ukraine actually, in fact, mobilized successfully, repelled the initial attack, and imposed within a very, very short period of time really unimaginable numbers of casualties. So I believe my numbers may be a little bit off here, but both the Iraq and the Afghanistan war together, the number of people killed and wounded, US soldiers killed and wounded in these conflicts, was far, far less than what Russia suffered within the first 2 weeks of the invasion. I should say we don't actually know exactly how many people were either wounded or killed. They are floating wide ranges of numbers out. Russia has admitted to about 1,500 soldiers killed. The Ukraine claims upward of 10,000 Russian soldiers killed. The truth is most likely somewhere in the middle. These kinds of numbers are very difficult to verify as long as the fighting is still going on. The other ratio of casualties, which includes wounded, there is a standard kind of like ratio that experts are using. For every 1 soldier killed, there are likely 3 more wounded. So this gives you about like 18,000 Russian soldiers that have basically been taken out of this conflict, either because they have been killed or wounded. These are tremendous losses for any kind of army, or for any kind of country. Yes.
Do we know how big their current military forces were to start with?
Yes, we do have a good sense. I don't want to like put out a number here that because I'm not an expert, but what I've from experts who are following this very closely is saying this is less than 10% of their overarching force that is being amassed. However, they're reaching the point at which the individual units will no longer be fully operational, right? So if you, let's say, lose all your truck drivers, right? You can't actually transport fuel anymore to the front lines, etc. So you don't have to basically kill every soldier or take every soldier out to kind of really hamper the invasion effort. And the Ukraine has definitely achieved that. So the invasion has stalled. There's no question. Loss of equipment, huge economic costs, sanctions, huge reputational costs. All of these are costs on the Russian side. Now, Ukraine has also already suffered tremendous losses. We know even less about how much they have lost than we know about the Russians, because the Ukrainians quite frequently, quite frankly, have kept a very, very tight lid on that. They're not telling us how many of their soldiers they have lost, for the simple reason that they're trying to keep the morale of the population up. What we do know is that major cities such as Mariupol, which is in the southeast corner there, it's been seen very, very heavy fighting in the last 2 weeks. About 80% of all the buildings are damaged or destroyed. It's a city that had 400,000 inhabitants, I think, before the war broke out. Then apparently still around 100,000, 130,000 civilians left in the city. Many have fled or have been killed, but we don't really know exactly how many. So tremendous losses on both sides. However this war ends, it will take the Ukraine decades to really rebuild and recover. But I should point out, we are nowhere near the end of this conflict. No, really, how are the Ukrainians doing? Aren't they doing super well? Yes, they are. They are doing actually much better. I gave this talk 3 weeks ago, just after the conflict had broken out. At that point, it looked really, I want to say, even worse for the Ukraine than it looks right now. So it's quite unbelievable what they have been able to achieve and how much damage they have been managed to impose on Russia. With a lot of support in terms of intelligence and weapons and training from the West, I should point that out. But we should also really look at that. There are about 4 million Ukrainians who have left the country. 4 million. That is, when I try to explain this to my kids, I'm like, well, just imagine where they're all going to go to sleep, to eat, and to the back. Like 4 million people. The majority of these 4 million people has made their way to Poland, which is currently basically distributing the refugees into centers or host families, etc. But many of them from Poland are going to go further into the European Union. But 4 million people is a huge number, mind-baffling number, and it's an extremely complex logistical problem, and how to keep track of them, how to provide for them, etc. The Ukrainians are definitely winning the information warfare here. They're running a very tight ship. They're all on message. They're very, very clever. You can follow the Ukrainian minister, the economics minister on Twitter. He's communicating with Elon Musk. He is like lobbying for support and for resources. He's answering questions. I don't know how he's doing that. I don't think he's sleeping. Of course, Zelensky, right? He is really media savvy, and his video updates always in this kind of green khaki jacket, always the same, like showing that he's still there. The Ukrainian tractors, John Deere, of course, right, pulling the tanks out of the mud. I don't know how many of you have seen these pictures. The Russian army has run into a lot of logistical problems. They don't have enough fuel for their combat vehicles, and so oftentimes they just abandon them, and then the Ukrainian farmers come in and just capture the tanks. So they're winning in that sense. But again, they have already suffered huge military costs. We don't know how many, huge civilian costs. And the question really is, how long can you hold out, right? Like if your populations are being starved, and Russia is strategically targeting not just military installations, but infrastructure, like, water filtration plants, roads, any kind of factories, communication networks, roads, to really make sure that Ukraine cannot resist or will stop resisting. So they're doing as good as they can, but the question is, how long can they actually hold out? Now, in order to really understand the conflict dynamic, we have to kind of think about how conflicts usually play out. There tend to be 3 phases. So there's of course, before the conflict breaks out, like the latent phase, but the ones I want to talk about is the phase where the conflict really escalates. And that's what we've seen basically for the first 3 weeks of the conflict, where the level of violence has kind of ramped up. After Russia saw that their first attempt to basically run over the Ukraine and take it over in a rather quick blitzkrieg didn't work out, they started escalating military action against civilian targets, indiscriminate shelling, bombing of civilian areas, etc. So for most of the last 4 weeks, we were really in the conflict escalation phase. At some point, any conflict reaches what we call a herding stalemate, where the 2 sides are kind of facing off and no one can win, no one can lose, and they're kind of caught in this. Oftentimes, fighting keeps going, but it dies down a little bit in intensity. It looks like we may be there just yet, as of today. There's a picture from today. Russia and Ukraine are holding peace talks in Turkey. It's not the first round. But today, apparently, Russia started signaling this yesterday, modify some of their strategic goals. They stopped talking about denazification, they stopped talking about demilitarization, and they say that they're really only interested in the separatist territories in the southeast. This is a complete, I don't want to say a 90-degree shift, but it's a pretty big shift in what they have been talking about in the last couple of weeks. And it may in fact signal that we have reached this point where Russia is assessing that it cannot possibly take over the Ukraine in the kind of way that they have planned to do. So we may be in this herding stalemate. The question is how long this herding stalemate lasts. Just because we got there doesn't really mean that we will reach the de-escalation phase, which is of course where we all want to be. It's important to note that Russia really can only win or make gains here or get concessions from the Ukraine by escalating. Whatever they want to achieve, they have to put up the pressure, right? Well, the only way that the Ukraine can win here is trying to de-escalate this conflict before all of their cities are basically destroyed and they're just complete rubble, right? So the Ukraine and Russia are fighting a very different war. Russia is fighting an offensive war. They're trying to conquer territory or control territory that is not theirs, while the Ukraine is, of course, fighting a defensive war, trying to hold them off, which makes solving this conflict relatively tricky. So how will this war end? Well, the problem is that Russia's plan A didn't really work out. Plan B didn't work out either. So they're still working through what they actually want, what plan C basically is. But there's no question that they have suffered tremendous losses, and in some way, shape, or form, they need to be able to justify these tremendous losses to their domestic audience, right? So in other words, how can Vladimir Putin get out of this conflict and minimize his losses, or at least maybe put a spin on it and say, well, we won something here. Until he can say, I won something here, he is likely not to kind of stop fighting. Again, the shift today in the peace talks suggests that they have settled on a different set of goals, which is more negotiable for the Ukraine, though still probably pretty hard to swallow. Of course, the Ukraine wants to keep its country intact. It doesn't want to give up any territory. It does not want to lose Crimean or the Donbas region, and it for sure doesn't want to have like a corridor that actually extends along the southeastern border of the Ukraine, which connects to Crimean and the Donbas region, which I think this is what Russia is aiming for. So they're really trying to put pressure on Russia, and will continue to put pressure militarily on Russia to force Russia to the negotiation table. Now, the third party here involved in this, and we're coming back to NATO, is NATO, of course. And NATO's main goal is support Ukraine, but try to avoid a direct conflict with Russia. They really want to stay out of this as much as they can. They want to support the Ukraine, right? They don't want to see the Ukraine defeated, but they cannot and will not actually send any active military support into the Ukraine. They cannot do that because the moment NATO enters this war, and the moment Russia realizes that it is basically a conflict between two superpowers, the United States plus NATO and Russia. So when I first give this presentation, there was this discussion of sending Russian MiGs. This is a Russian fighter jets, basically, that Ukrainian pilots can operate, know how to operate, sending Russian MiGs that Poland still has to the Ukraine to basically support the Ukrainian air defense. And there was a big back and forth over whether or not they would do that. And the Polish president basically said, we will do it if the Americans give us American fighter jets in return. And the Americans said, sure. But why this deal never went through is because he couldn't figure out how to actually get the fighter jets to the Ukraine. Now you say, well, can't they fly them there? No, because the moment you fly them there, the Russian shoots them down, right? All of a sudden, you have a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, which you want to avoid. The Polish suggested to move the MiGs to Germany and have the Ukrainians pick it up there, but the Germans didn't like that idea either. So no fighter jets so far. This is just an example for how even this weapon deliveries that the West has been engaging and NATO has been is very, very touchy. One missile on the territory that lands on the territory of Poland, right, could actually trigger and escalate this conflict beyond the Ukraine. And nobody really wants this. So that is why NATO and President Biden and all other NATO members say there can be no no-fly zones, because the moment you impose a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, what do you have to do? You actually have to enforce it, which means you have to shoot down planes who violate that. And the moment you start shooting down Russian planes from NATO territory, again, conflict between NATO and Russia, which nobody wants. Russia doesn't want it, NATO doesn't want it, the world doesn't want it. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was one of the reasons Germany wouldn't take the jets is because of their dependence on Russia for oil?
No, no. It is for the very reason that Poland didn't want to send the MiGs from their own territory. That is, like, they will of course become targets of Russia. With potential that Russia will actually try to shoot those jets before they actually enter Ukrainian airspace. Yes, Germany is dependent on oil and gas, and that is complicating the international response very much. But that is not the reason. It's just that this transfer of this kind of military equipment through a third country is extremely tricky without basically tipping or without escalating the conflict.
Becoming a victim.
Questions here from the chat. One is, how can Russia's promises be trusted when they continue to attack?
They cannot be trusted.
Okay.
That is absolutely clear. They need to send. This is a general problem that any state faces, not just Russia. We call this a problem of credibility of commitments. Can you ever trust an adversary that they will actually keep their deal? The answer is no, right? And so how do you actually demonstrate the credibility? We say, well, you can send a costly signal. That's really hard for you. And in the case of Russia, what Russia has started to do today, they have started to withdraw troops from Kyiv. They said, we're done fighting around Kyiv, the capital of the Ukraine, and we are going to withdraw our troops and we're going to move them back towards the Belarus border and, you know, whatever, somewhere else. That is what we call a costly signal, right? They're giving up positions that they had secured to show, yes, perhaps we're going to de-escalate. Now, any strategist will say, well, these troops are not just like withdrawing, right? Of course not. They're going to go somewhere else to reinforce other Russian troops. This is like a giant chess game, and you should never really trust the other side. But on the other hand, but you need to find, next slide. You need to find a negotiated settlement here. So how will this war actually end? What are the possible scenarios? And these were 1 through 4 were the possible scenarios that I put down 4 weeks ago. I took out number 1. Yes, that's a good one. So my number 1 was Russia wins. That is out of question. Russia is not going to win this conflict, at least not in the way that they imagined it.
I was going to ask, have you read any of Patrick Buchanan's op-ed pieces?
No, I have not.
Okay, well, politically, he's sort of anti-world, pro-American.
Yes,
And he's saying, what the hell are we doing getting involved
yes,
in this war? And he cites the fact that for the last 50 years, while Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, we could live with that. So
yes.
why should we get involved in that?
Why should anybody get involved? Well, so this is a very, very good question. The most fundamental answer is that under the international order, the way that it exists, every state has a right to exist, right? Like every state has a right to rule its own territory and to protect its boundaries. And in fact, under international law, aggressive war is outlawed. You are not supposed to try and conquer another state. Now, we know this doesn't always work out this way, right? We use force all the time. The United States for sure does. But this really is shaking a foundation of the larger international order. Now, does the United States have to be the policeman here? No, absolutely not. But who says?
Are there many people who subscribe to this? So far, he's the only one that I've read that promotes, but I bet there are right-wing people in the United States who feel that way or will eventually feel that way.
It's not just about right or left wing, right? So whenever we get involved or any actor gets involved in these conflicts, right, it has the risk of escalation. Why this conflict is so unique is that, again, no one was surprised that Vladimir Putin would assert his interest vis-a-vis the Ukraine, but the means by which he chose to do so in essentially aggressive, offensive war aimed at taking out a sovereign country really scared a lot of other countries in the general vicinity, right? So the Baltic countries who have a very contentious relationship with
In Poland.
Poland, of course, yes. Finland even, right, which borders with Russia. And yeah, so this is not just any country, but it also really threatened the balance of power, the status quo in Europe. There are serious scholars, I would say, who also argue that, there have been a series of missteps over the last 20 years or so that Europe did not take the security concerns of it seriously. I'm pointing this out. I am not convinced that this is true. In fact, many European countries have engaged in, have actually pursued a strategy of constructive engagement with Russia. Or just kind of opposition leader, Navalny, who's poisoned by Russia, and then returned to Russia. Yet actually, this is of course all getting lost in the war. He was sentenced, I believe, for his,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think he's gotten several years and given for in prison for, wait for it, insulting a judge. And what did he say? He said, "Oh my God." And it wasn't what he said, but how he said it. That he's getting 8 years in prison for that. So, you know, we are dealing really with a increasingly authoritarian, I mean, it's always been an authoritarian system, but so right now, any last remnants of civil society are being shut down in Russia.
Do you think that, like, even though NATO is not doing it,
Yes.
no, they're not per se involved. The fact that like multiple independent companies are like we're coming out of Russia, we're coming out of Russia, we're
Yes.
coming out of Russia. Do you think that maybe is having a bigger impact? Because it's almost been like the world minus like China.
Right. So so what is the international community doing, right? So sanctions have been imposed, and that's kind of a standard measure that the international community uses to kind of really try to, I want to say, to deter actions from occurring. That's when sanctions are most effective. You impose them before something happens because you want to signal we are willing to impose costs on you. In general, sanctions don't work super well like that. We still use them all the time because it's better than military action, which we don't want to do. However, I want to say what makes this situation so unique is the scale of the sanctions, how widespread the participation in the sanctioning regime is in the West, I should say. If you look at which countries are sanctioning Russia, it's still only Europe and the United States and a couple of countries in Asia. And that private actors are following suit, right? So that, McDonald's is pulling out and closing up shop. Investment banks are pulling out of Russia, etc. So that is really, really unprecedented. It also means that we do not really know what the consequences of this are for us or the larger global economy. It's really unprecedented. Sanctions create what we call a collective action problem. They work best if everybody kind of like imposes them simultaneously and the costs are being shared. But individual actors, individual countries, of course, have an incentive to not participate because it's really costly to be part of the sanction regime, right? So getting everybody to actually agree to do it is hard. And that the Europeans, again, got their act together this time so quickly was really astonishing. The question is, how long will they stick together, right? How long will they actually agree to keep these sanctions up? Because effective sanctions hurt both the target, that is Russia, and the sender, right? They're costly signal. They're imposing costs on us as well.
I was thinking, trade is very important, and I was in favor of China opening up our business people. I was in favor of our business people going to Russia.
Yes.
I figure when trade occurs, it benefits both sides, and if trade doesn't occur, both sides loses, as
Yes.
you pointed out.
Yes.
So the incentive should be to have a stable country,
Yes.
okay, and have a decent economy and be able to sell your products, particularly if all you have to sell is resources like Russia has.
Yes.
And it hasn't worked.
That has not worked. That is the strategy, I think, that, the constructive engagement I mentioned earlier that many European countries pursue. Germany is a really great example. Getting large parts of its energy from Russia, has really active trade partnership with Russia. And the idea there was there too, right? If you engage in trade, you build trust and you create connections. And over time, this creates a stable relationship. Well, it does until it doesn't. And so the question is, how do we get back there? And there's not going to be a very quick pathway to the status quo as we know. Once you actually cut off a country from the global economy, it will take a while to basically get it back in. Sanctions usually work best if you give, like any threat, if you give a very clear goalpost, right? So if you do X, then we will remove the sanctions from you, right? In this particular case, the X would be get out of Ukraine, which Putin is not willing or not able to do at this moment, right? So the sanctions will remain in place. I don't know if they're being discussed at these peace talks, right? If there are questions raised to loosen some of these sanctions. I'm not sure that this is currently being discussed, but maybe.
We had a question from online, which was, and if you have already said this, apologies.
No worries.
What's the history reasoning for the separatists' existence in the Southeast?
Yes. Sorry, I'm just going to race through the beginning, which this map here. So you should be able to see this map, and if you look at the color scheme here, you see the areas which I'm looking for words. What color is this? Brown green. So the darker shaded areas, areas in which a large group of people lives who identify Russia as their first language. So we could call them ethnically Russian. They're Russians, right? There's a large ethnic minority of Russians actually living in the Ukraine, which is not surprising. First of all, it borders Russia. The historical boundaries have moved several times, but also, of course, this is part of the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of migration from Russia, what is now Russia, into the Ukraine and vice versa. So these regions have a large Russian minority, and that's in fact why the separatists make these claims that they want to be independent or have an independent status. And of course, Putin justifies their existence by saying that they are being repressed by the central Ukrainian government. That's the short answer.
What does Russia hope to have after destroying so much of Ukraine? What kind of victory would it be?
Well, so remember, their plan A was that they would roll into the Ukraine with their tanks, and then there would be maybe a coup in Kiev, or the government in Kiev would just say, oh, we're scared, and run away. And that they could relatively easily install basically a puppet regime in Kiev. Now, from what I've read, and I want to say, take this with a grain of salt, there is some rumors that the Russian Secret Service had actually paid quite a lot of money to some people in the Ukraine to organize this coup. And the Ukrainians apparently took the money and never did anything with that. But of course, if you were Russian Secret Service and Putin asks you how everything is going, right, you're going to say, great. And so most likely, and I'm, again, take this with a grain of salt, right? This is a story that will be written when we actually have access to the real documents here. Most likely, Russia's invasion plan was based on absolutely faulty assumptions and faulty information. They really did not know what they're walking into here.
It's interesting, didn't Hitler use some of the same strategies?
Yes.
In
Yes.
Austria?
Yes.
And
Yes. It's very reminiscent. My son was studying for AP World History, the annexation of Austria and, you know, this, the conquest of Poland. And yes, there are very strong parallels, I would say.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so earlier you said that the Crimea and that Donbass area,
Yes.
I think it's called, there had been fighting at, I don't know how recent that was, but
Yes.
maybe way back when. So is there do they have like a parliament in Ukraine where there are representatives from these areas?
So Ukraine has a parliament, and the Donbas region is not fully controlled by separatists. They control several major cities. So there are representatives from these areas in the Ukrainian parliament, but these are not the separatists, right? So the separatists are not participating in the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainians in the separatist government. So they are really trying to maintain or create independent republics. And in fact, before the outbreak of the war, Putin recognized Luhansk and Donetsk as independent republics, as sovereign states in essence, right? So he could justify defending them.
Which they weren't.
No, which there weren't. And this is a different story, right? How do you become an independent state? It's a complicated story, but the short answer is you have to act like one, and everybody has to recognize that you act like one. And then so far, only Russia recognizes that these are independent states. Yes.
When right before the invasion, there was like the buildup of
Yes.
like the war games. Where was that?
So in two parts. So the part along the, I'm sorry, let's take a, I actually have a battle map here. So you can see the territory that's shaded red.
Yeah.
That's territory which is being contested in essence, where Russian troops have been maneuvering and fighting. And so along this area, you had a buildup of Russian troops. Some parts up there in the corner with Belarus, and in fact, there were some joint troop exercises with Belarusian troops. But from what I've heard, some of the Russian soldiers were not aware that they were being sent to invade the Ukraine. They were in fact being told that they were conducting a joint exercise with Belarus, right? And then they got their marching orders, and so that also explains some of their confusion and their problems. And then the other big buildup you had really along Luhansk and Donetsk, which was fully expected. Russia had military installations there all along, and they just keep pulling more manpower there.
Another question from online. The Ukraine seems to be surprisingly prepared to fight with Russia with military force.
Yes.
Who are the primary suppliers of Ukraine?
So supporters of the plan. So the manpower on the ground is Ukrainian, I want to say. I'm thinking it's mostly Ukrainians. They have been recruiting foreigners, which I don't think is a good idea, but they have recruited foreigners, which would be kind of mercenaries, right? And they create kind of foreign legions. That's a small amount. That's mostly, I would say, for publicity. Those are not the guys who are winning the war. It's the Ukrainians. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. I do not know this 100%, but Ukrainians in general are much better prepared for this kind of conflict because they have actually been fighting in the Donbas regions in the last like 8 years. So conflict and war is something that they're present with. I think they have relatively widespread military training, basic military training for their populations. And so as soon as the war broke out, they called for general mobilization, right? This is hard to say, but no men over the age of 18, I think, was allowed to leave the country. Why? Because they were being called to defend the country, right? So the refugee stream is mostly women and children. And elderly, and yes, and so anybody who is capable of fighting, men or women, have been issued, weapons and have been trained. So the manpower on the ground is largely Ukrainians. Now weapons and stuff. So I would say they have been supplied generously with anything that they can operate, and that doesn't cause too much problems with Russia, right? So anti-tank missiles, you see them, these shoulder things, like probably small arms, all of that's super important. I want to say what's even more important is the intelligence support that they have been given. That will never be fully acknowledged, and we officially don't really know it, but I have no doubt that there's a direct line between US intelligence, British intelligence, and the Ukrainians providing information about battle positions, where the Russians are, etc. Strategic movements, right? And of course, the United States broadcasts these things live on television, right? It's basically, oh, we think Russia is doing X, Y, and Z. That is information, and that's super valuable for the Ukraine as well. So they're getting a lot of international support, not as much as they want, I would say, but quite a lot. We should also point out, often people say like, well, why don't we send them better weapons? Well, you need to be able to operate them, right? Some of the most sophisticated weapons that the United States has, you actually go through several years of training. So that's not useful to them.
Has there been any indication that China is supporting Russia?
Yes. So China, of course, has very recently signed like a support and friendship pact with Russia. And early on in the war came out verbally both supporting Russia and the Ukraine. And this was very, very schizophrenic. They actually sent aid, humanitarian aid to the Ukraine, while at the same time basically verbally supporting Vladimir Putin. So they were very cautious in that because they do not want to harm their relationship with the United States, right? They're very much dependent on the United States and on economic relationships with the West. They're very much growth oriented, right? Like economic growth and political growth. And they took note very quickly that this was not going well for Vladimir Putin. And so they have been treading very carefully. That's the short answer.
Does anybody else online have any questions they'd like to ask? You can unmute yourself and speak to the room.
So I will go to the end, which is who are the winners and the losers?
Mhm.
If anybody has questions there. These are just some kind of very incomplete thoughts. We often think of the global implications of this, and I already mentioned the Ukraine and Russia are both suffering and are both losing. Global economy is a no-brainer. But the winners are a little bit more surprising. Non-Russian oil producers like Venezuela, which had been under a very strict sanctioning regime, which was now loosened so that they could sell their oil on the global markets, right? Keep the oil flowing, stabilize oil prices. US producers will benefit from this greatly. It will take a while to wrap up production, but this is it. NATO and the European Union, all of a sudden, a newly found kind of sense of unity. And I put Republicans in the midterm elections. Sanctions are costly, right? And of course, now if you're a Republican, you're going to advocate for sanctions, of course. And of course, Democrats would do the same thing, by the way. It's nothing about Republicans. Come midterms elections, they will point to rising gas prices and rising consumer goods and say, well, doesn't this administration do a bad job, right? That's fair game. But yes, so there are also domestic implications here that we may not think about, but they may play out in the next couple of months.
There's a question here about Putin and war crimes.
Oh yes, Putin and war crimes. So the first, I guess this is 2 words, but I turned this into a question. Are war crimes being committed? Yes, almost certainly yes. War crimes are crimes, which means that you can be held responsible for them. Will Putin be held responsible for war crimes? That is unlikely. We don't know the full extent yet. I want to point out, it's very interesting. In the last couple of days, there have been some news about war crimes committed by the Ukrainians, shooting prisoners of war. That is a war crime too. Once you have a prisoner of war, once an enemy combatant has surrendered or to combat, you are not supposed to harm them. You're supposed to provide aid if necessary. And there have been some videos circulating. They're unverified, but videos been circulating. That is a war crime as well. I'm pointing this out because the way that the Ukrainian government has reacted to these is really a stark contrast to the way that Putin has reacted. They have said, we will investigate and we will hold those accountable. And that's in fact how most war crimes are being dealt with. It's usually the responsibility of the armed forces to actually hold their soldiers to the standards of international humanitarian law.
Geneva Conventions?
Geneva Conventions,
Okay.
yes.
So I noticed that the neighboring countries, like the refugees coming over the border, people, like I remember on TV seeing like a family from Denmark, like we have room for 8 people, like a super outpouring.
Yes.
And it seems to kind of contrast to like the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely.
And you got people trying to get across the border and, it would seem like we don't like those refugees.
Yes, this is a really good, it's a really heartbreaking kind of observation. On one hand, it's wonderful to see how these refugees are being, received with open arms. But then, of course, with anybody who has recent memory of the Syrian refugee crisis and has seen the dramatic footages, right, or the attempts to cross the Mediterranean, etc. Yes, there's
Or even Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yeah, that's a little further away. Yes, more recent for us, of course, Afghan refugees. Yeah, we're taking in 100,000 Ukrainians like this, right? But Afghan refugees, we're not touching. So yes, there's
Even if they fought for us.
even if they fought for us, and even if their lives are directly threatened. So yes, this is a very complicated reality.
I put that somewhere on your chart.
Yes, of course. I'll gladly talk about that more. Though the reality is, should we turn the Ukrainians away? Of course not.
No.
No, right? So I think in the short term, this is wonderful. This is great. In the long term, we have to ask ourselves, not the Germans or the French or the Danish, but ourselves, right? Would we open our houses to just anybody? And if the answer is no, right, then we can't really point a finger. Then we have to work on ourselves first.
Now you have to admire the Polish people.
You have to admire them, and I do think this is really remarkable. I don't
If you
think,
look at the history over the last 1,000 years,
yes,
they've been on both sides of
they're
war.
both sides, yes,
Yeah,
but it's a fact that, and I think it's a very human fact that we think of our literal neighbors often more warmly and more kindly than people that we really do not have any knowledge for. And for the Poles and for the Europeans, the Ukrainians are neighbors, right? They often have close ties to people in the European Union already, right? They speak the language and so on. That does not justify discriminating against other refugees at all. This is just an explanation of why it is in this situation easier. Yes, but I should also point out, we are 1 month into the conflict. In Germany, we have the saying, like visitors start smelling like fish after a couple of weeks. The question is, of course, how long this warm welcome will last, because no matter who the refugees are, right, there are going to be conflicts and problems of caring for them, integrating them, providing food for them, finding work for them, schools for the kids. Who's going to pay for that? Like, these are kids, they speak Russian, they speak Ukrainian, they probably speak 2 languages, but they may not speak French, So how do you actually provide services for them? And if you don't provide for them, that's like resentment right there. So it is it's a difficult situation, and it will also play out not quite as happy as it looks right now. I think that's my prediction.
But in the long run, I think any country that welcomes them will benefit economically. They'll contribute to the workforce. They'll become loyal citizens. And if they've survived, they've got survival skills.
Yes, and in fact, many of the Syrian refugees that made it to Europe, right? Europe took in millions of them, and they have radically changed really the fabric of many of the societies. Germany is a much more multi-ethnic and multicultural country than it used to be when I left it in 2001, largely because Angela Merkel made a conscious decision to actually invite refugees in with large pushback, right? From local communities, and large pushback. I think at the long term, she was proven right. Her strategy worked, but it came at political costs and also local costs, right? So for communities, this is not always easy.
But I think we should, if you look at our population dynamics, we're not having children. We don't. I think there was an article recently in the paper where nearly every county in the United States had more deaths than births.
Yes.
And we're crying for a labor force.
Yes.
And we don't even want to import our labor force. So where the hell are we going to get it from?
Yes.
And we need people
Absolutely.
for our economy to grow.
Yes. Now, I don't want to go down, this is a different route, but I should also point out that the line between a refugee and a migrant is merely a definitional line, right? So many people on our southern borders who we label migrants are fleeing from violence and destruction, just like the Ukrainians, right? It's just because we don't accept the violence they're fleeing from as
not war to them.
It's not war
to us.
Yes,
Yeah.
so the distinction between migrant and refugee literally is a legal distinction, right? It's not had anything to do with the lived experience of the people.
No, I've gone to a Rotary meeting in Honduras, and it's the only Rotary meeting I've been at around the whole world where you were surrounded by AK-47. Okay, just think of how lucky we are. We can go to a Rotary meeting and not have to worry about having at least 3 armed guards escort you there. And that's the way they live.
Yeah.
And if you do something the soldier doesn't like, you're shot.
Yes.
No questions asked.
The other thing that seems to me that lurks throughout this refugee crisis is COVID, the specter of COVID and the possibility for mutations that then spread around the world.
Yes. So, I mean, COVID, there are other COVID, of course, is, we just went through this. We don't want to go back, but there are other health crises that are brewing there, like tuberculosis, typhoid, AIDS. I've heard because people don't have access to medications to keep infectious disease under control. And many of the refugees are not living with families, right? They're living in large, like soccer stadiums, like gyms and stuff like that. So yes, COVID is of course also a concern. Though the Europeans have a pretty good system in place, a little bit more systematic than our approach, I'm sure.
Would China be a winner or a loser in this?
That's a good question. Both, I would say.
You think both?
A loser because, of course, China is really integrated into the global economy. If the global economy suffers, which some economists are really worried about, there's some rumbling that Russia may default on sovereign debt. So, every country borrows on global capital markets, and occasionally it has to pay these interests. And if a country cannot pay these interests, this has a ripple effect through the banking system, the global banking system, and can cause, a global financial crisis. And so that's something, of course, that any major economic player, be it China or the United States or Europe or Japan, is really, really nervous and worried about.
And it should be. Well, China has a lot of our debt. They're buying our treasury notes.
Yes. But in terms of winners, right? So China has, of course, is watching and learning, right? They also have territorial claims on breakaway, Taiwan, and so they are again they're taking note. They see that in fact the West can act united. They see that the West can actually impose costs on them, and I think that's really a useful learning experience for them. They are not being weakened by this, right? So that's why I put them in the winners column.
It would seem that any negotiations, maybe not immediately, but soon after, would require Russia to pay to help rebuild the destruction they caused.
Yes, so that would be the right thing to do. But international negotiations usually don't work that way, unfortunately, right? So you can claim as much as you're willing to fight for in some ways. So as long as Russia can still impose costs on the Ukrainians by bombarding cities, for example, you cannot ask Russia for concessions like reparations, right? So I should say, I didn't talk about this talk, but Russia has shifted from a heavy manpower investment, right, like sending in the troops basically, to long distance shelling. So they're sending in, cruise missiles, etc., just to take out targets that they think strategically important. And the Ukrainians can't do anything against that, right? They can fight the army on the ground, but they can't do much against these incoming missiles. So Russia still has some leverage to pull in its military to really not win this war. That's not what it's about. Impose costs on the Ukraine, right? And make sure that they don't have to make these kinds of concessions.
The reparations bother me, and I'm generally opposed to them. When you think of what happened to Germany after World War I.
That's a myth. Don't get me started. But so yes, Germany had to pay huge reparations, but Germany asked much higher reparations of the French after the Franco-Prussian War.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, but then we come to World War II and we have the Marshall Plan. And for Japan as well.
Yes.
And instead of making them pay reparations, we help them rebuild their economy, and they've become one of our best allies.
Right, but also when you help them rebuild the economy, they can repay their war debt, right? So that's for England and Great Britain. Yes, so none of this was money for free, right? There was a strategic calculus behind it that worked well for everybody. It was kind of a win-win situation.
I'd like to see something like that.
That would be better, right? But again, this is not a situation where you have a winner who can impose terms, right? The Ukraine is not going to win. It's not going to defeat Russia, right? The best case for the Ukraine is that Russia basically withdraws its troops from Ukrainian territory. The maximalist vision that the Ukraine really, really wants is to have all of Russian troops out. That's very unlikely. So that means Crimea and the Donbas region, no Russian troops whatsoever. That would be the magic win for the Ukrainians. But they're not going to defeat Russia, right? They're not going to be able to dictate the the terms of the peace to Russia like the Allies could after World War II. And that's a really big difference.
So I hear a lot that, like if chemical weapons get used,
Yes.
that's like
The red line.
the red line. And I'm like, the red line was already crossed in Syria and we did nothing. Well,
Yes.
we, world. And so if NATO won't get involved because they don't want the head-to-head, like who is going to hold Russia to account if they're used? I mean,
Well, so this is again, right, international negotiation. This is a coercive bargaining into action where you're trying to get your enemy to abstain from an action. In this case, use chemical weapons. So how are you doing that? Well, you're saying like, if you use chemical weapons, we will get involved. That's the maximum cost you can impose on them. And then the question for the Russians is this a bluff? Now, if they watched Syria, they know, well, maybe it is a bluff, right? But they can never be 100% sure. And this is basically all this talk about the red line, what it's supposed to achieve. Will NATO really truly get involved when chemical weapons are being used? I don't know. I suspect they will retaliate. I suspect they will do something, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they will start bombarding Russia or send in the ground troops. Right? It's a very carefully calibrated tit for tat here that you're seeing. Syria, President Obama actually put military intervention or military strike in response to chemical weapons use to Congress, right? He says, give me authorization and I'll do it. Why did he do it? Why did he ask for authorization? Well, he knew full well that they would deny it to him. So.
Another online question. What can we do? How can we support the Ukrainians as individuals?
That's a really great question, actually. So the first is pay attention, which you are all doing while you're here. I have noticed that the conflict is, it's not surprising we get tired of it. Crisis is not something we can sustain, right? But the conflict is dropping out of people's consciousness. We have learned to live with this. It's just 4 weeks, right? But we have learned to live with this as this conflict going on far away. Keep on paying attention. Be informed about this. If there is a question of, supporting refugees in Manchester, either by material support or emotional support, right? Like that's something that individuals can really do here as well. Manchester is a refugee receiving center. I don't know if we will get Ukrainian refugees, but even if we don't, right? Like showing kindness
Get all
to
the
the
others.
I was going to say, giving kindness
it's a
to the
good
others.
operation. It's a very good operation
Yeah.
that they run.
I would say if people, Ukraine needs everything right now, right? In terms of donations, I would probably think about the Red Cross or really global non-governmental organizations who can actually provide services. It's always really difficult. What can you do? Our impetus is, I had a colleague actually, not from St. A's, but from another university. He's like, oh, I'm just going to go to the Polish border and help. That's what we want to do, but it's not necessarily the most helpful thing to do. So going through accredited organizations that actually have people on the ground and know what the needs are, that's really
The Polish church, not the Catholic Church, but the Polish
Yes.
National Church.
the Polish churches are generally also very well organized.
Bishop Jotkowski has a partner church in
Yes.
Poland that's taking on refugees,
Yes.
and they're collecting money.
Yes,
The Ukrainian church in Manchester is also collecting money.
yes, and the question is always, where is that money going? Is that going to a place that is really helpful for the Ukrainian
Well,
effort?
the Ukrainian churches, the money and supplies go directly to Ukraine. The Polish church is sending the money or medicines and food to a church in Poland. Yeah.
Yes.
So you can know what church it is and know that it's
And
going
where it's going
directly to
somewhere.
people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's always Doctors Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders, yes. So those are there are some really great. I don't know if they actually operate in the Ukraine right now, but there are some really great organizations. But I say like keeping the conflict kind of like in our minds is already really important. And if checking what we hear and what we've been asked, what we've been told, I think as well. Right? So this is, especially in the United States, always a little tricky.
It's something like $60 or $90 for each package you send over. So you better send, the bigger the package, the better.
Yes.
I mean,
So-
there's a money transfer.
So in
cost,
terms
yeah.
of actually material goods, this is always a little bit, so the Ukrainians really, many of them have even money, right? They go to stores and buy the things that they need. So I think it's often easier to, provide actually financial support. And then you can make sure that if somebody needs prescription medicine or something like that, that can actually be provided for them. But yeah, it's a difficult question because the conflict is also moving so fast, right? Once we reach the reconstruction phase, I think there's more that we can do, than actually of financial support and donations, etc. Again, like fundraisers will become helpful. We're not yet there, right? But Kiev and Kharkiv and Mariupol and all these other cities that are being bombarded, they will have to be rebuilt.
Well, the Germans did a great job on Nuremberg, Dresden.
Yes, but it also took decades, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't
Well,
happen.
they did a good job on the West German side. On the East German, you look at the architecture, it's not as beautiful as the,
Less money,
less money, yeah.
less money.
But also the difference is the East Germans realized they lost. Whereas in Russia, they're still saying it isn't their fault.
Yes.
So,
Yes. The Russians again don't, currently people who live in Russia have a really hard time actually even getting accurate information about this conflict, right? They're living in we always complain about our media. No, they live in a 24-hour propaganda machine where even the schools are being provided with video messages on what to play their kids, right? There's no choice really. You want to watch Fox News or NPR or whatever, right? There's no choice. It's all the same. This is very, very different. It's a fine-tuned propaganda machine, and it's very difficult to escape. There are people who are, of course, who are informed and who find ways to stay informed, but it's much more costly and much more dangerous too, actually, in Russia right now. So yes, there's no admissions of defeat there. In fact, they say Plan A has worked.
So Putin isn't going anywhere.
Well, crystal ball. No, I don't think so.
Okay,
but-
crystal ball question.
Crystal ball
Sorry.
question. No, I mean crystal ball question in the sense that, like this, for any democratically elected leader, would be disaster, right? There would be real accountability probably at the voting booth, presumably. Now that doesn't happen in Putin. There are of course people who have a vested interest in the Russian state, right? Putin is not the only person holding power, right? He has like a group of oligarchs and government officials. But it is unclear at this point who would be the leader of any kind of pushback group. I don't want to call them opposition, that sounds too nice, but any kind of counterbalance point to Vladimir. And in fact, the question always is, would whoever's after Putin be better or worse? That's also, we don't know, right? Right now, there's a lot of question what's actually going on within Russia and within the Russian government. There are senior officials who have not been seen for a couple of weeks. Statements being put out are kind of strange. So people are literally reading the tea leaves right now. Who is actually making these calls? What is Putin doing? What is Putin thinking? So that's why crystal ball. And people who know much, much more about domestic politics in Russia than I do.
I think there was an NPR interview where they interviewed a Russian citizen, and she was very irate and said, "Why do you people keep picking on Putin?"
Yes, and he is an admired leader. Probably not by everybody, right? But
But
you
this
will probably
woman
find-
was very, very forceful in her.
yes.
All right. Well, does anybody have any other questions or anything that they wanted to say? Thank you so much for a really informative evening.